extreme heat, raging wildfires, and powerful storms. The climate crisis is only getting worse all around the globe. Now scientists are revealing the results of a new study on the health of the planet. Hi everyone, I'm Sean Calebs, and this is The Heat. A new study is raising the alarm about the health of the planet. Scientists with the Earth Commission quantified safe and just boundaries for climate, biodiversity, freshwater, and different kinds of pollution to the air, soil, and water, and found most thresholds have already been breached. The international community is working to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius under the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. But the United Nations Weather Agency says the world could hit that limit within the next 5 years, exposing even more people to extreme temperatures. Now, for more on this study, let's bring on our panel. Joining us from Mombasa, Kenya, is David Obura. He is the founding director of Cordio, East Africa, an organization supporting sustainability of coral reef and marine systems in the Western Indian Ocean. And from Amsterdam, Joyita Gupta is co-chair of the Earth Commission and a professor of Environment and Development in the Global South at the University of Amsterdam. Joyita, I want to begin with you and talk a bit about the Earth Commission study. After reading it and reading a number of reviews and articles on it, it seems like if you took the Earth to a physician and said, oh, okay, check me out from top to bottom, how am I doing? The results weren't good, depending on how you carve these up, whether it's 8 different issues, whether it's 5, 6, 7, there are a lot that show that the Earth is not in great shape and the situation is only getting worse.
Yes, in fact, what we are seeing right now is that in the 5 domains that we've looked at, we have identified safe boundaries beyond which we might hit a tipping point or we might find an irreversible impact. We've also looked at the just boundaries, and the just boundaries look at areas in which irreversible harm is caused to human beings. So, for example, we argue that at 1.5 degrees centigrade, we can avoid 4 major tipping points, but at 1 degree centigrade already, we're exposing tens of millions of people to high temperatures, to sea level rise, etc. And that means that the just boundary should be more at 1 degree rather than 1.5. So the story that we are trying to present is that we have got 8 boundaries for the 5 domains. These boundaries are the more stringent of the safe and just boundary.
David, if I can switch to you, let's talk about the world's least developed nations, because it seems like they are hit much harder than a lot of the developed nations as well. And I want to begin by just kind of walking us through what the situation is like in Kenya and other parts of the continent and Africa in that region.
Well, thanks, Sean. So in Africa, the thing is, many people are living close to the poverty line. Many people are very directly dependent on the environment. And what we did in the Earth Commission is we looked at biosphere boundaries, so the amount of biodiversity, but also the ability of landscapes and seascapes to support people. And what we found is that we're already going below the safe and just boundaries in these areas. And what that looks like in Africa is, with climate change, with increasing temperatures, unpredictability of rainfall, that really makes people's livelihoods much more precarious and much less certain. People are being forced across their limits. And of course, that leads to migration, that leads to people having to move to try and find places where they can grow their crops or graze their livestock more effectively. But those migrations, of course, result in interactions with others, concentration of people, and conflicts. So people are really being pushed to the edge by the approach to and the crossing of these boundaries that we've identified.
And Joyita, let's talk more about that, because when you talk about just, I kind of interpreted that as justice, which seems to be what David is talking about. And people need to live in environments that are safe, in environments where they can grow their crops, where they can find potable water. What are your concerns if we continue unimpeded and the temperature continues to rise, we continue to have issues with all the things we talked about, atmosphere, groundwater. Are we going to see these migrations, and is it just going to make for a much more unstable Earth?
It's not only going to make for a much more unstable Earth, it may even make it impossible for us to live within these Earth system boundaries. The problem is that you can, so when we look at the justice issue, there are two elements here that are very important. The first is, how do we ensure that the system is functioning in such a way that we don't cause significant harm to people? That's the first part. So it's creating the outer boundary of the space that we have. The inner boundary of the space is, how do we meet the needs of the basic needs of people worldwide, whether it's to water, food, energy, and infrastructure. Now, what we did was, in our narrative, we looked at, if we meet the basic needs of people worldwide, whether it's to food, water, energy, and infrastructure, how does that translate into CO2 emissions, into nitrates, phosphate emissions, into water use, etc.? And we found that if we do this in 2018, we would cross planetary boundaries even more. And this implies that it's not enough for us to just simply think that we can be rich and just provide a little bit of resources to the poor. No, this whole provision of resources to the poor will imply that we have to change the way we live. So that's one of the problems that we have, that our justice approach, which David Ogura referred to, the impacts on people, the displacements, that shrinks the nature of the corridor that we have before us. And what shrinks it even further is that if we try to meet the basic needs of people, we will use a lot of these resources, making the space even smaller.
David, this is clearly a wake-up call. How do you get people past the numbers? If you look at Somalia, last year the United Nations said at least 43,000 people died in Somalia as a result of the worst drought in 4 decades. This year, the UN says some 6.5 million Somalis are expected to face acute food insecurity. And it's not just drought. The torrential rains and flooding in Pakistan last year, I was in Afghanistan at that time, and the rain didn't stop at the border. It hit Afghanistan just as hard. There just were very few reporters in that area. How do you move past, okay, this is the concern, this is the concern, this is the concern, to just shake people and wake them up? This is a crisis, people.
It is a crisis, you're right. And I think to get past the numbers, you need to touch people's hearts, not just their minds. And I think people need to realize that these climate crises affects everybody. And I think the summer heat in northern temperate climates, I think, is really bringing that home to many parts of the world, and these fires that have raged across many parts of North America, Europe, and Australia, Canada, in the last few months, is that these are all part of the same system. And what I think the message that needs to come through, that Joyita has really been emphasizing with this justice narrative, is that if we just try to raise everybody's standard of living to what we consider acceptable and dignified levels and escape from poverty, we would further exceed these boundaries. What it really needs is that we need to end the overconsumption that happens, because this idea of climate debt is a very similar one to biodiversity debt or injustice, is that there are very high consumers who have consumed so much of the planet's carbon or biodiversity budgets that there's no space left to increase it for others. And we really need to identify how everybody can do what it takes to reduce the overconsumption in order to bring up the minimum limits for millions or billions around the world and stay within or return within these planetary boundaries that we have identified, these Earth system boundaries.
David, it's probably taken me a little too long to get into the issue about oceans, why that is so important, how much heat they absorb. But to tell people, give people an idea of just how critical that is right now, it's my understanding if the ocean would raise, say, 1 degree centigrade, that will kill off many coral reefs across the world. And just describe to us how important those are to fish habitats, to communities, to knocking down storm surges from hurricanes, to feeding the world. It's just a cycle that just continues.
Well, you're right. And the ocean has absorbed perhaps 90% of the heat that would have been in the atmosphere had the ocean not been doing this service for us. But that has impacts on the ocean itself. So we saw the first major impacts of warming of the oceans to coral reefs back in 1998, before we were really thinking on a grand scale about climate change. And it's accelerated since then. We've had global bleaching events. The third lasted for several years, a few years ago. That's knocked back coral reefs, perhaps 50%. We've lost about half of coral reefs, the combined impact of this warming and local threats like fishing, overfishing, and pollution and so on. And 1.5 degrees is identified as the safe limit for coral reefs. But, as you said, we're perhaps 5 years away, some predict, from crossing that or reaching that. We need to really limit warming to every extent we can. Every decimal degree is critical. So coral reefs provide food, they provide coastal protection for many cities, villages, coastal development around the world. And we really need to understand the benefits that we get from nature in order to sustain them for what they sustain us with.
Joita, I want to give you the last word. I wish we had more time because obviously we could talk quite a while on all of this. But China is pledging to hit peak carbon dioxide emissions in the year 2030. And they say they want to become carbon neutral before 2060. It's an ambitious goal. And certainly the rest of the world is going to be watching to see how China does, considering the amount of pollution that comes out right now. What would you say to people who are watching China right now? And is there anything out there that gives you hope for the future? Let's end on something positive.
So I think that what gives me a lot of hope is the fact that the young people in China and also neighboring countries like India are probably very, very concerned about the impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss. So I expect that the young people will really try to put pressure on their countries and try to change their lifestyles. So this is my hope. But I also think that countries like China and India have a lot to do in terms of demonstrating that it is possible for these giant countries to change the system. And because they're so large, it's very difficult to change. But if they are able to change, they will have a massive impact in influencing the entire globe's environmental system. So if China is able to get its act together and make sure that it becomes the world's leader in renewable energy in all fronts, and it actually phases out fossil fuel also effectively, not only in China, but in its investments abroad, that will be fantastic.
Joita, David, I really want to thank you for the discussion, and let's stay positive for the future. And we appreciate your reports and also your insight. Thank you again. Okay, we are going to stick with our theme of talking about the environment. Moving on, China, the Republic of Korea, and some Pacific Island nations are raising safety concerns about the Japanese government's plan to release treated radioactive wastewater into the Pacific Ocean. The contaminated water is being stored at tanks at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant that was crippled by a devastating earthquake and following tsunami back in 2011. Now, Japanese regulators started a 3-day inspection on Wednesday at the plant in what could be the last hurdle before the wastewater is released into the ocean. Beijing is among those calling on the International Atomic Energy Agency to intervene.
China hopes that the IAEA Secretariat will uphold the principles of objectivity, professionalism, and impartiality and fully respect and adopt the opinions of experts from all sides of the technical working group, come up with an evaluation report that can stand the test of science and history, and will not endorse Japan's discharge plan. The international community will wait and see what the results will be.
For more on the environmental concerns and impacts, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Einar Tangen, and he is a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute and chairman of Asia Narratives. Also with us from South Carolina, Tim Mousseau. He is a professor in biological sciences at the University of South Carolina. And from nearby Maryland here, Arjun Makhijani. He is the president of the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. Arjun, I want to begin with you. And before we get too deep into it, let's explain to the audience what has been going on since the year 2011. This wastewater has been, for lack of a better word, stacking up. There are now many, many tanks holding this wastewater. Japan is really kind of at the end of what they can do with it. They can't continue to store this forever. That's the reason they're turning to look to pour this wastewater into the ocean, and obviously a great deal of pushback. Walk us through where we are now and some of your concerns.
Well, as everybody knows, there were 3 meltdowns in 2011 after the tsunami, the reactors have to be cooled. or more of the buildings blew up, and so there was rainwater inside, there was groundwater coming up. So there's a lot of contaminated water accumulating that was treated and with filtration systems that changed over the years, and it has been accumulating in these tanks. The reactors need to still be cooled until the molten fuel is taken out. So wastewater that is quite radioactive will continue to be generated for decades. Uh, TEPCO, the power company in Japan, say we're running out of room. I don't agree. I've been looking at this pretty intensively for a year and a half now as part of the expert panel of the Pacific Islands Forum. I think there are very sensible alternatives. Dumping is a poor option, and dumping is really a technical term that is used in the 1972 treaty to prevent marine pollution by stopping dumping. And so that is what TEPCO planned. The IAEA actually looks to be set to give the green light. Um, but in my opinion, and I've given a lot of thought to this and published a paper today on this, the IAEA is not fully implementing its regulations. It is avoiding the hard questions, and especially I I am very clear in my conclusions, both scientifically and examining the IAEA requirements and guidance, that the IAEA is basically effectively abandoning the safety and protection interests of the Pacific region countries, Pacific Islands Forum members, China, South Korea, Philippines, and so on.
Tim, you've been very outspoken on this. You're someone who, I don't think I'm mischaracterizing it by saying you don't believe that nuclear energy is a green alternative in moving forward. Right now, there are, more than 1,000 steel tanks at the site that will be released over 30 years. And we're talking about everything from tritium, which has a half-life of 12 and a half years, to carbon-14, which could be 5,000 years. What are your concerns about this?
Well, let me start by saying that I'm really not here to speak to the issues with respect to the dumping. I'm here to speak to the science associated with this. The fact is that one of the main contaminants in this stored water is tritium, radioactive hydrogen, and as we have shown in a recent publication, this isotope, this radioactive isotope of hydrogen, has not been well studied. We really have minimal understanding of what the long-term impacts will be to the environment should all of this wastewater be dumped into the ocean. And that's really my main concern in this whole topic.
Well, let's talk more about that for just a second, because a lot of the research that's been done on that, as I understand it, is either theoretical or you're in uncharted territory.
Indeed, because it's hydrogen, and because it's what we call a beta emitter, it's quite hard to measure, and as a result, it really hasn't been well studied. Some of the other radioisotopes that people might have heard of, cesium-137, for instance, strontium-90, these were released by other accidents like Chernobyl and have been quite well characterized in terms of their potential environmental effects. And in fact, most of my career has been spent in Chernobyl looking at the impacts to the biota in that region. But when it comes to tritium, which again is the main effluent that's in these tanks, it really is a big unknown as to whether or not this radioisotope will, for instance, bioaccumulate in the ecosystem. In other words, increase in concentration at the higher you go up at the food chain, to the fish, for instance. We really don't know. What we do know is that tritium has the capability to bioaccumulate, but nobody's really done the empirical studies to really validate that in a general way. We also know that tritium can cause genetic damage. It can lead to increased mutations. It can lead to cancers in the systems that have been studied. Interestingly enough, it has not been studied in humans at all. So, again, there's just too many unknowns to be releasing vast quantities of this into the environment at this point in time.
Einar, I want to turn to you, because China, as we mentioned, is calling on the IAEA to act in, quote, an objective manner. And it's not just China. There are a number of entities. Fishermen in Japan have been raising concerns. Shoppers in Japan are concerned. They say they've just felt comfortable about buying fish from that area now. Give me your thoughts and really what people in the mainland are saying about this.
Well, I mean, right now people are concerned. I mean, they hear radioactive and water and release, and they say, you know, I'm not going to be buying any more fish from Japan. It's also spilling over into consumer areas where basically a boycott of some Japanese cosmetic companies is coming in. But, you know, what we have here really is a series of natural and then man-made disasters. The natural one was the tsunami, which caused the original damage, but the man-made ones were, you know, basically locating this nuclear power plant in a very dangerous area, not equipped to handle the situation, too close to the sea. Then you had the government and TEPCO lost all credibility. TEPCO admitted it had been lying for years to the public, saying that only treated water had been released. The government had a lot of missteps in there, did not communicate well. And as a result, what you have today is no one believes it. Now, right now, what the Japanese government is proposing is the least costly method of dealing with this contaminated water. But it's a false equivalency, a false choice. It's not a question of storing or getting, you know, or storing it forever. The issue is how do you deal with it? And there are a number of different methods. One, which would be putting it into concrete and using that concrete in areas where, you know, it's not going to come into contact, including the plant itself. This has been endorsed, and it would certainly take care of the problem and not release, but it would cost more money. And as a, you know, if you study this whole period, this whole time, you know, the issue has been about money. There were bad decisions made about how to originally treat the wastewater. There was a better method that was available outside of Japan, and they decided to go with a Japanese company who could do a limited job of doing it. So, as I said, trust has been broken, and no one's really going to believe that this is being handled in the proper way at this point.
You know, Arjun, also when people talk about nuclear waste, it is just a frightening thing to discuss. And if you consider that the town is just a ghost city nearby, and now they're talking about getting the water that has been used to cool that for such a long time and dumping it back into the ocean, you can understand why people are more than concerned. The IAEA is going through its final stages of its investigation, checking the area right now. What are they going to be looking for?
Well, the IAEA seems to have accepted the dumping plan by when it accepted to do the review. As part of the expert panel, we've had a number of discussions with IAEA and with Japan and with TEPCO, and the IAEA has a very narrow view of its responsibilities to the extent that it is ignoring key parts of its own guidance. For example, its guidance requires justification. Do the benefits outweigh the harm? Well, for the Pacific region country, there are no benefits, and there's going to be some harm. You can argue about how much. So benefits never outweigh the harm, and it is not justified. Now, as was mentioned, the concrete alternative was actually proposed by the expert panel in August 2022, and we published a detailed paper on the concrete panel about a month or so ago, outlining it. I don't believe that the concrete option has been studied in terms of cost. I'm not sure it will be higher cost. In my estimation, it will be over faster and therefore reduce the risk. And most important, I think it would be in compliance with the IAEA justification on optimization requirements, which the IAEA has been ignoring. The IAEA here faces a loss of reputation itself because it is not enforcing or advising. It can't enforce. It's not a regulatory body. That's up to Japan. But it's not advising Japan to fully follow its guidelines. And it has, in discussions with the expert panel, explicitly refused to consider justification. But I will say part of the IAEA's rationale is that everybody's doing it. France is discharging tritium, Britain is discharging tritium, nuclear power countries, whether it's France or Britain or the United States or China or South Korea, they're all discharging tritium. I think everybody should stop dumping, but the point of concern right now is Japan. The IAEA has long not properly viewed this issue, in my opinion, and it should start now with Japan by saying, examine the concrete alternative. It's being laid out. Take it seriously. Otherwise, you might face a loss of your own reputation.
Indeed. Tim, I want to get back to the biological studies as well, because I was poring over a number of articles throughout the day, and one I came across, and I hope I'm characterizing this correctly, that there was some research going on about butterflies in the area just ahead of the accident. So they do have some kind of base level to look at that. What are your concerns as they move forward? You don't have a lot of time, and it's difficult to cram all this into just 15 minutes. But when you talk about nations like Fiji that are concerned about what's going on, and the only healthy stock of tuna in the world, you can understand why people are so concerned about the ecosystems.
Yes, indeed. And again, it's really about the fact that there have been no investments into the basic science, the basic ecological and environmental studies that are needed to really put some sort of boundaries on the risks associated with this release, or, as Arjun has mentioned, the releases from every other nuclear facility on the planet. But that, again, is not the issue for today. There really, there were some really nice studies done by Japanese workers on butterflies before and after the Fukushima disaster, but they related mostly to cesium contamination, radioactive cesium rather than tritium. There's been virtually nothing done on tritium in Chernobyl, nothing done in Fukushima, and basically really minimal work done in the laboratory even. And so, yeah, there's this vast void in our knowledge that needs to be filled before we can rationally predict what the environmental consequences might be of this kind of release.
Einar, I'm going to give you the final word. We don't have a lot of time, but do you expect a bigger pushback if the IAEA goes ahead and greenlights this and Japan does begin dumping?
Well, I think the pushback will be by governments and consumers. They're the ones who are going to lose out here, and unfortunately, it's going to affect the nuclear industry. The IAEA is supposed to be the gold standard. As my colleagues have pointed out, they're supposed to be protecting the public. But by basically whitewashing this, they do put their own future in jeopardy because, yes, I mean, whether you like it or not, nuclear is an option. It has to be safe. There are things going.
I'm going to have to cut you off there. Gentlemen, I'd love to have you back. This is an issue that isn't going away. I'd love to delve into this in some 30 minutes down the line, but thank you very much. I'm Sean Caleb here in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching yet another edition of The Heat.